This is the PowerPoint for Chapter 12, and just a reminder that all images and videos within this PowerPoint are in the public domain. The four main topics that we'll be covering within this PowerPoint video are the Madison's presidency and the War of 1812. We also have this era of good feeling that results after this war, an era in which you have Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe as consecutive presidents. We also then have a huge topic to discuss. It's the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So those are the main themes that we'll be talking about in this PowerPoint video. Don't hesitate to give me an email or a phone call if you have any questions. And this is the intro for Chapter 12. To start Chapter 12, we'll look at the War of 1812 and some of the leading American heroes of the war. We have General William Henry Harrison and Navalman Oliver Hazard Perry. We'll talk a little bit more about those two in the future slides. On the eve of the War of 1812, the regular army was ill-trained, ill-disciplined, and widely scattered. They were sometimes distinguished by their speed of foot in leaving the battlefield. The United States military is not very well prepared for this war. The War of 1812 was a 32-month military conflict between the United States and England. The United States declared war in 1812 because the British trade restrictions brought about by the impressment of American merchant sailors into the Royal Navy, and also the trade restrictions. The war was fought at sea, with warships and privateers of each side attacking the other's merchant ships, and the British blockaded the Atlantic coast of the United States and mounted large-scale raids in the later stages of the war. Now, both land and naval battles were fought on the American-Canadian frontier. This large frontier, this large border between America and Canada, ran along the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence River, and the northern end of Lake Champlain. Initially, with the majority of the British Army and naval forces tied down in Europe fighting against Napoleon, the British only fought a defensive war in America. They repelled American invasions, but as this changes, the British become much more aggressive in Europe, in the United States in their war. So Napoleon invaded Russia at this time in his war in Europe with 500,000 men. This in contrast to the American military. James Madison tried to invade Canada with 5,000 men. So we have a military of 5,000 men that are very, very inexperienced. Napoleon has an army of 500,000 men. So the British are a little busy with Napoleon, but when this war dies down in Europe, the British start to focus a little bit more on the battles in the United States. Oliver Hazard Perry managed to build a fleet of green timbered ships on the shore of Lake Erie. Oliver Hazard Perry captured a British fleet in a furious engagement on the lake, and he then reported that we have met the enemy and they are ours. So Oliver Hazard Perry did a great job in the Great Lakes. Also, kind of in your book, it talks about the green fleet that was constructed from green timbers, but even greener Navy men manned these ships. After losing control of Lake Erie, the British were forced to withdraw from Detroit and Fort Malden and were overtaken then by General William Henry Harrison, the Battle of the Thames. At the Battle of the Thames, the British lost, and Chief Tecumseh and his Red Stick Confederacy were defeated. These are a couple of images of the battle at the Thames. The British victory at the Battle of Bladensburg in August 1814 allowed the British to capture and eventually burn Washington, D.C., but they were repulsed in then an attempt to take Baltimore and Fort McHenry. In 1814, the British were defeated eventually at the Battle of New Orleans. But this was in January of 1815. So back to the Battle of Washington, D.C., or the burning of the Capitol. It's a portrait here of burning the White House. And then the story goes that Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, was able to, at the last minute, rescue the famous presidential portrait of Washington, General George Washington. And one of the last things that Dolly Madison did as she evacuated the White House is to make sure that the famous portrait of George Washington was secured. That's the burning of Washington, D.C., or the White House, the Battle of 1812, War of 1812. One of the more famous stories in the battle, or the War of 1812, was the Battle of Baltimore and Fort McHenry. So this is kind of a picture of the Fort McHenry and the way in which we have Francis Scott Key, and as he is witnessing, the story goes, as he is witnessing this battle at Fort McHenry, he composes Star Spangled Banner as he's watching the bombs burst in air. And so anyway, I thought that was kind of an interesting story that I wanted to call your attention to. It's in your textbook as well. On page 240 in your book, Andrew Jackson is talked about. Andrew Jackson was famous for his battles against the Indians and rounding them up and forcing them to sign peace treaties in the South. But during the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson was probably most famous for the Battle of New Orleans, battle in which it was in January 1815. 2,000 British killed and wounded in half an hour, as compared to some 70 for the Americans. It's an astounding victory for the United States, for Jackson and his men. But I wanted to call your attention to the fact that one of the most interesting parts of the Battle of New Orleans is that it occurs January 8th, 1815. The treaty to end the war is December 24th, 1814. So the idea that the battle that Andrew Jackson won for the United States actually occurred after the war is over. But this treaty is signed in Europe, and it takes a long time to get word back to the United States. This became a huge rallying cry for the United States, a victory for the United States, and it really boosted American patriotism and American resolve and morale. And it led us then into a period of nonpartisanship to some extent, at least in presidential elections, and it became known as the era of good feelings. During the War of 1812, some of the disgruntled northeastern states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Vermont, they were disgruntled because they were losing valuable trade because of the war, and they got together and demanded certain things. They were very upset about the perceived Virginia Dynasty of presidents of Washington and Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, William Henry Harrison, all of these Virginia presidents, the Virginia Dynasty. So these are Federalists. Well, these are northeastern states demanding compensation for lost trade during the war, a two-thirds vote before war could be declared by any new state admitted to the country, or two-thirds vote before any war could be declared or any new state admitted to the country, and to abolish the 3/5 clause in calculating proportional representation, limit the presidents to one term and no two successive presidents from the same state. This is to address the Virginia Dynasty. Now I wanted to come back to this. Abolish the 3/5 clause in calculating proportional representation. So the 3/5 clause, according to the northeastern states, or the free states, 3/5 clause gave the South a proportional advantage in the House of Representatives. So they felt like Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, because they counted slaves, or at least they counted 3/5 of the slaves, that gave them a higher population, thus higher representation. Thus, if you have higher representation in the House of Representatives, you also have higher representation in the Electoral College. Higher representation in the Electoral College leads then to a Virginia Dynasty. So anyway, that was the Hartford Convention. But as the War of 1812 winds down and is won by the United States, some of this kind of dies down as well. So this is the Virginia Dynasty that I was talking about on the previous slide. This is also talked about in your chapter worksheets. So we have Washington, and then Adams is the second president. So George Washington Adams, but Adams is from Massachusetts. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. So of the first 5 presidents, 4 from Virginia. Eventually then we have several more that come from Virginia. That's the Virginia Dynasty. So after Madison serves his 2 terms, we have a presidential race in which James Monroe wins. And so we have 3 successive presidents, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. All 3 are from the Anti-Federalist Party, or the Jeffersonian Party, or the Democratic Republican Party, however you want to call it. But these 3 presidents lead to a label called the Era of Good Feelings. But it is a bit of a misnomer. Just because we have 3 consecutive presidents, 24 years of a single party in office, doesn't mean that there's not political problems. We have an economic panic of 1819. There's broad over-speculation in frontier lands, the growing pains of the West. But James Monroe does get elected to a second term. So that gives us Jefferson for 2 terms, Madison for 2 terms, and Monroe for 2 terms, bringing this era of 24 years to be labeled the Era of Good Feelings. So we want to talk about the Missouri Compromise at this point. And I want to look at in 1818 here. In 1818, the North was beginning to gain very significant advantages over the southern states in particular, population. That's the key. Population. Of course, wealth, manufacturing, transportation, infrastructure were also key, but population is very important. Population is important because it has to do with the House of Representatives. It's the legislative body based off of the Virginia plan that we talked about several chapters ago. Now, at the time, you had in the Senate, in the United States Senate, it's based off the New Jersey plan, where both states have equal representation. Both states, all states have 2 senators. It's maintained when you have 11 states that are free, so they had 11 times 2 equals 22, and then the 11 slave states, so 11 times 2, 22. When you want to have any kind of legislation proposed that was advantageous to the North or advantageous to the South, it was deadlocked in the Senate, 22 to 22. Even though the North was gaining advantages because of their population in the House, the Senate could prevent any legislative advantages. Now that's key, because as Missouri is being considered as a new state, it's going to be significant if Missouri comes in as a slave state or as a free state. If it comes in as a slave state, then you add 2 here. And then the slave southern states have a 2-seat advantage in the United States Senate. But if Missouri comes in as a free state, then it becomes extremely significant, because the North already has advantages in population, so they already have numerical legislative advantages in the House, and they could potentially have advantages in the Senate. In this way, they could pass legislation that was advantageous to the North, or even possibly anti-slavery legislation. So, as you look at or examine the entrance of Missouri, a compromise has to occur. So the compromise initially is Missouri's going to come in as a slave state, so you add two slave senators to the South, but will also admit Maine in as a new state. So you have both Maine and Missouri entering, and then your proportions stay the same. So you have 24 and 24. You have this equality to exist. Even though the North is gaining population and they're gaining legislative advantages in the House, this stays the same. So the next compromise is extremely important. A line is drawn. A line is drawn at 3630. All future bondage was prohibited in the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase north of 3630. So let's take another look at this map here. 3630. Let's draw a line right here. Now you can kind of look and see the writing on the wall. What is going to happen to Kansas? What's going to happen to Nebraska? What's going to happen to Colorado? What's going to happen to all these potential states? They'll come in as free states according to 3630 in the Missouri Compromise. In the South, you maybe have Oklahoma, maybe have Arkansas, maybe Texas, maybe, even though these are not U.S. territories yet, eventually you could potentially have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6 states coming in as slave states south of 3630. But in the North, you're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, maybe 10, 11, 12. If you have 12 states coming in as free states, but only 6 potential states coming in as slave states, and the House continues to sway with population in favor of the North, and this number continues to grow for the North. So this compromise, this Missouri Compromise, it's a temporary fix. It lasts for over 30 years. This is a compromise of 1820. Civil War does not start until 1861. There's another compromise of 1850 that eventually takes the place of the Missouri Compromise. But the writing's on the wall for the South. It becomes pretty clear that eventually a map, something to this effect is going to take place, where you've got all of these northern free states and very few southern slave states. I'd like you to spend some time on page 238 of your textbook looking over John Marshall's court. The last time we talked about John Marshall, we were talking about judicial review in Marbury versus Madison, but John Marshall continues with Maryland case, and this case against Virginia, the Gibbons case. All of these cases demonstrate Marshall's willingness to expand the power of the court. Take a look at those cases on page 238. Then one of the last themes of this chapter is on page 242, and it's the new president Monroe, Monroe's Doctrine. And Monroe's Doctrine expresses this large feeling energized by this post-1812 war, this feeling of nationalism, giving a voice to a spirit of patriotism. And so this is on page 244. This Monroe Doctrine, it bluntly directs the crowned heads of Europe to keep their hands off of the Western Hemisphere. This is kind of ironic considering the crowned heads of Europe, mainly the British, have just burned the White House to the ground. So if it wasn't for Napoleon and other concerns in Europe, I don't think the Monroe Doctrine would have carried much weight. The British just kind of ignore it, but at the same time they do not violate it. So that's the last theme of this chapter. Spend some time reading that on page 242. That concludes the PowerPoint video for chapter 12.